Hello and welcome to the Triple A Chinwag. Triple A is for Authentic Anti-Racist Allyship. My name is Wayne Reid. I'm from BASWA, which is the British Association of Social Workers and Professional Officer and Social Worker and Anti-Racism Visionary. So back to the Triple A Chinwag, Authentic Anti-Racist Allyship. In 3 episodes, I'll speak with Andrew Thompson, who I consider to be an authentic anti-racist ally. I know Andrew from previously working with him at Sheffield Youth Offending Service, where he was a Youth Offending Service officer, and also he was a specialist practice teacher in youth justice. Andrew was instrumental in developing Sheffield's Juvenile Justice and Race Panel in the 1980s, which later became integral to the development of Sheffield Youth Offending Service. I confidently vouch for Andrew as being a straight-up, authentic, anti-racist ally. He's reputable and he's high profile and well thought of in the social work community in Sheffield and in South Yorkshire. The Triple A Chinwag is an opportunity for you to have some insight into Andrew's personal and professional outlook with regards to authentic anti-racist allyship. Andrew has been a friend and mentor for me for a number of years, and I refer to him as the Obi-Wan Kenobi of social work in the social work anthology Outlanders. So why is it worth watching? Well, in the Triple A Chinwag, we hope to explore the lived realities of Andrew's lived personal and professional experiences. We'll also look at some of the social work values and demonstrable relevance to social work. We'll also highlight core social work values and ethics. We'll also look at different practical resources that will assist people both personally and professionally in terms of anti-racism and allyship. I hope that this Chinwag will inspire and motivate stakeholders and partnership organisations to take action with regards to anti-racism and allyship. At the end of this episode, I'll be joined by my colleague Liz Howard, who is also a BASWA professional officer, and also Maureen Maguni and Rachel Rook, who will have a reflective discussion about what myself and Andrew have looked at. I have with me today Andrew Thompson, who I've met with previously on this show in part 1. This is part 2. I'm going to ask Andy just to reintroduce himself briefly, and we're going to carry on where we left off in terms of authentic anti-racist allyship discussion. So over to you, Andrew.
Thank you. I mentioned in the first introduction several things I've done. Worked in youth justice for 30 years, ran a boxing gym, amateur and professional, for a total of 20 years. They were related, the work isn't related, but what we're talking about in terms of anti-racist allyship, there's a definite crossover for me as an individual white person in those roles. What I didn't say in any detail, if at all, was that for the last 20 years in youth justice, part of my job was as the specialist practice teacher, youth justice for Sheffield, where I would supervise students from university courses, masters and undergraduate level, mostly social work students, and I would supervise them on placements in youth justice, and I'd oversee their work, but I also made sure that the agenda of anti-racist practice in youth justice was a fixed part of our supervision, with the weekly supervision with my student. I did group sessions about it, and I also went in on the back of that, went into universities to lecture about youth justice, and some of those were specifically about youth justice and race. If they weren't specifically about youth justice and race as a lecture, I always introduced it as a topic that was considered separately and in focus in and of itself, because the problem didn't go away. The overrepresentation of black kids coming into the system, going through the system far too quickly, didn't disappear, and the spillage from that issue into social work was absolutely irrefutable.
I'd like to ask you some further questions to begin with. The first one is, have you faced resistance from people of colour or white people for being an ally, or for prioritising anti-racism as much as you have in both your personal and professional life?
The term resistance is probably overstating it, but in the very early days when I had the idea that I wanted to do something to address the racism that I saw in the youth justice system, when I had the idea to start what was in those days, it was called a juvenile court, not a youth court, mid-80s, and I wanted to start the Juvenile Justice and Race panel. There was scepticism, not resistance, from some of my black colleagues, understandably, and it was proper scepticism because of, we didn't have the language then, but the white saviour was certainly, you know, the last thing I wanted to be was a white saviour. I wanted to work collaboratively to address what I was seeing as injustice. And the sort of knight in shining armour was a worry that some black people had. And also, you know, I had to make it clear that I wanted to work collaboratively, that I saw a problem in terms of black kids being treated differently and much worse by the criminal justice system. If I ignored it, I couldn't also ignore the fact that that made me part of the problem. I was colluding with it. If I wasn't part of the answer, I was part of the problem, and I didn't have to be black to see that injustice. What I also know is that where that white saviour risk comes from is, so I'll sort it out. I couldn't. I needed to listen. I needed to work collaboratively with my black colleagues who knew far more than I will ever know in terms of empathy and the lived experience of being black per se, holistically, and how that translates into youth justice. I can understand the law. I can understand what I see to be inequality, but nuance and the subtlety that's you need more than good intent. It's great to have the intention to stop it, but as a white person, it isn't enough. And if you think it is, you're likely to get clunky, oversimplified conclusions to what you see as the injustice. You need to work collaboratively. So there was as I say, some skepticism at first, dealt with quickly and always dealt with honestly and openly, which I still would say that's the way forward. Talk, listen, don't think you're going to know everything, and the problems get navigated. From white people, white colleagues, there was, my impression was that some people thought, all well and good, but, because you can, as a white person, you can think, yeah, but there's a lot of real work to be done in youth justice, and that notion of it was a bit of a sideshow, a bit of a bolt-on. I never felt like that. I felt it was intrinsic to the whole thing that we were doing. It was an intrinsic part for me. And I think that some white people, nobody was obstructive, but there was, I was left to get on with it, I think. As it gained traction, I got a lot of support from white colleagues in youth justice, but there was always, when you stepped out of the immediate colleagues, when I stepped into talking to magistrates and sometimes judges and the training we would do then, and into schools, those sorts of things, some of the things that I heard then, and obviously I'm paraphrasing because this was 30 years ago, but some of the things that I heard were exactly the same things you hear in terms of their content that are floating around the ether now, like white working class kids are disadvantaged at school, you know. Well, coming from a council estate and leaving school at 15 with no qualifications, I think I knew about that. And funnily enough, I also knew even then that all lives matter. And so I was facing that, but I didn't have the language to deal with it. But all I did was carry on, and I made sure that if I was trying to get diverted into, yes, but there's more to life than racism, I'm saying everybody knows that. What I'm saying is, in youth justice, and then spilling into social work, the social work arena, there is this specific problem that you can't reduce, and neither would I want to reduce any of the other inequalities that people see and mention. Everybody can have a piece of that. Everybody can be working at it. So there was some. It was easy for white people. It was easier for white people to minimise it.
Sounds like you were very much in the minority with that thinking.
I think I was, and I think I was. I'll be honest, Wayne. I was scared because, you know, I told you my background. I'm not an academic. I was more arrogant when I was younger, and I think we'll refer to that later. So I was ready to say what I'd got to say. Yeah, because of the inherent arrogance that came from who I am and how I am. But I was frightened, and I now know that a lot of that was probably a good thing. I was frightened because, you know, the depth of my knowledge wasn't anywhere near the depth of everybody else I was talking to. But I still felt that that didn't excuse me from saying things that I needed to say. And then with my black colleagues, I listened and I learned. And even if I thought, not sure I agree with that, I would ask and I would listen and invariably learn. There were institutions, and a lot of those institutions have set ways of being. CEOs in the different institutions had ways of seeing things. What they wouldn't have time or vested interest in realizing is that a lot of the behaviors in those institutions were systematically oppressive to black people. And you didn't have to look far to see it. And quite honestly, sometimes you can still see it in the institutions today. You can't say that, you know, the bad apple. I don't think you can say that, well, yes, of course, there's some who don't want to listen to this. There are some, and we can deal with them. And the institutions sometimes are pretty good at dealing with those. But as a bedrock of how the court system functioned, it was very, very easy for anybody within the criminal justice institution as a holistic entity to say, wherever you want to think about magistrates, police, youth justice, any of us, you could say, it's simple, Andy. If they don't commit crimes, they won't be arrested. And it doesn't matter whether they are black or white. But if you drill down further and look at what was happening from the very point of not even arrest, but who was being policed with a small p, which areas there were lots of police walking about, which areas where there were no police. And it was different. And black people were being policed and then therefore brought into the system. And you could see that happening all the time. And before the criminal justice system, it was happening in schools. And if we're to ignore the fact that those institutions unwillingly collude with racism, I think you're ignoring a huge power dynamic. And it can be ignored by the institution because they have the power. Because, you know, whatever white people want to think, black people in this country are a small minority. People that are going through the criminal justice system or are involved in social work are an even smaller, further reduced minority. This huge white system has massive power and can ignore aspects of their own systemic behaviour that might be oppressive. I wanted magistrates to listen to what I'd learned, not because I think I'm the only one with something to say, but I wanted to say, if you listen to this, look at the data and think about this, you can see that perhaps the magistracy needs to look at this with some blinkers taken off, or the Crown Court judges, or the police, or social work, or youth justice, any of us. We needed to do that. And I often felt that the institution's initial response to my approach was, I'm ready to defend myself. They're ready to defend against me. And I didn't want that to happen because I think you have to collaborate.
Definitely. Yeah. And I mean, there's a few things that you've said there which conjure up different images for me, really. I suppose the last one that you just mentioned about the defensive response that you got from some organisation made me think about white fragility, both at an individual but organisational and institutional level as well, and that immediate sort of defensive response. The discussion or the content that you talked about in terms of institutional kind of behaviours and systems and so on, I guess, as you mentioned, there are some criticisms of institutional racism. We've discussed in other times about racist policies, which is a kind of a concept that I've woven into some of my written work as well, which I think is more incisive than institutional racism. I still believe that institutional racism exists, but I think that, you know, racist policies is actually even more incisive and specific than that. So I actually agree with both concepts. And the other thing was around, I guess, white supremacy and how that manifests itself in some of these institutions and systems that you've talked about, and how they interlock almost those different systems, you know, the youth justice system, social work, law enforcement, court service, etc. And they have a kind of individual but a collective oppression on black and ethnic minority groups, and as you say, the data bears that out, doesn't it?
Yeah, oh, it does. Yeah, everywhere you look, it's utterly irrefutable. Big numbers, big overrepresentation of disadvantage. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So thinking about those barriers to individual and organisational allies, Andy, what would your best advice be for people who consider themselves as potential allies, or who are new to the concept of allyship? What would your sort of principles or advice be?
The principal advice, and as I say, people can extrapolate their own extrapolate the thinking into their own situation where they want to be an ally, is don't be scared. Don't be scared, and don't take advantage of the white privilege that you have to actually, because you're scared, do nothing. Just leave it. Because, well, I know I think this, but I'm not going to bother because it's going to be bumpy. It might be bumpy, but actually, if you're open and honest, it's an enjoyable ride. Everybody benefits, white people, black people, individuals. So I would say to people who are genuine about it, who don't think that they're going to be able to sort everything out, don't be scared. Go in with an open mind, and whatever else feeds into your thinking about why to do something. It's a Martin Luther King Jr. quote that I had on the wall many years ago. He talks about vanity, he talks about politic, but he says, you know, ask yourself, is the position right? And if what you're doing is right, and you know and you feel it is, then don't be scared. And think about whiteness. And I know that's kind of more modern language than certainly the time that I was starting this out, but it's a really helpful term for white people to think about whiteness, because 99% of white people say, what do you mean? Which kind of tells you. So I would say, have a look at that, don't be scared, and get on with doing what you're doing.
Thank you, Andy. And what advice would you give to your younger self in terms of allyship then? Well,
yeah, I'd say shut up a bit and listen. In fact, there are plenty of people who probably think that about me right now. But seriously, I would say don't be scared to just listen and process information. Because I'm a talker, not a listener. If there are default positions, that's mine. But yeah, I would advise myself to listen. I would also advise myself to not be distracted from what I was doing, and to carry on. And if you do both those things at the same time, keep going and listen, you can sophisticate your own practice and hopefully make more of an impact.
Okay. Yeah. And are there any kind of specific books that spring to mind that you've read? I mean, I know we can't read ourselves into activism, and I'll talk, or we'll talk more about that later in this episode. But are there any specific books or authors where you think, yeah, that really sharpened my thinking on allyship?
Yeah, James Baldwin, his work was utterly profound because of when he wrote those things, and because of who he was. But the James Baldwin stuff that I've read, modern, I've read and been to see Afua Hirsch speaking and Rennie Edo Lodge. I've read but not seen speak Ibram X. Kendi. The one I'm reading currently is Living Black, by, I think she's a French Algerian, if I remember accurately.
Living While Black.
Living While Black, that's it.
Yeah.
That's it. And yeah, brilliant. And the way that the modern authors take the stuff that's been there for years and years and articulate it in contemporarily relevant language. And it's not just about semantics. I worry that, if I'm honest, predominantly white people who want to defend a position start to get into semantics, usually academics, but that's not to reject academia. I think you need both. I read lots of books about anti-racist practice. I read lots of books about life's experience as black people. Particularly, it can be anything. Any black author that is weaving through their experience of what their life as a fill in the gap, footballer, boxer, social worker, and you know, all of them have got the same things to say about
Mm-hmm.
this wall of oppression that's going to fall on you at some point. And you know, and we took microaggressions is a term that wasn't used when I started this work, but those sorts of things. So I read because it familiarizes me with the language, and I'm nowhere near an expert, and I know that I will say, in inverted commas, the wrong thing sometimes. I would hope that people would forgive that, because it is just semantics, but one does need to get a contemporarily relevant way of articulating the things that one is doing. So yes, I read for those reasons.
So Andy, I'd like to share with you next a slide from the presentation that I deliver quite often at different places within social work, different organisations, employers, higher education institutes and so on. And it's a slide that is the definition that Ibram X. Kendi gives in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. Hope you can see that okay.
I can, yes.
Perfect.
I can.
So I'll give you a moment just to familiarise or refamiliarise yourself with that definition, and then I just wondered what kind of how that might apply to your worldview, I guess.
It lines up with it in perfect accord.
Yeah.
Anti-racism is the active dismantling of systems, privilege and everyday practices that reinforce and normalise the contemporary dimensions of white dominance. This, of course, also involves a critical understanding of the history of whiteness. It does involve a history, and I wish as I alluded earlier to, my memory is not what it was, but when I listened to David Olusoga, I think is his name, the historian, the black guy that's his historian, his knowledge of history underpins everything that he's saying, that Ibram X. Kendi is saying here. The belief that all races and ethnic groups are equal and deserving of the same opportunities. I've known that at a feelings level from very, very many years ago. Knowing how I take advantage unwittingly of not acting that out is about the history of how I was brought up. And I think all white people just have to recognize that. Don't feel that you're somehow guilty of something. What you were taught was wrong, what you internalized was wrong, and you need to question that. And that's, I suppose, at an individual level. And what Kendi's talking about here is dismantling the systems, which I think it's a brilliant 2 short paragraph explanation of what anti-racism is. And in particular, there are forms of racism, different forms that we've talked about before, but there's a profound effect if you look different when you walk in from white people. So if you're black and you walk into a room, all the things we're talking about in the video.
Part 1.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I think that what is capturing there in the description is everything that needs to be said about it, both in terms of the what the next step is from just it's not enough to just recognize that don't be racist. You can tell yourself, well, I'm not a racist, and I hear various forms of that said, and I know, again, it's well intentioned, but the intent isn't enough. You have to then think, and when I see these systems and these individual horrors playing out, what am I going to do? And what you're going to do is be anti-racist. And if you don't do that, you are sliding into being some form of collusion, I think. So, and I think that descriptor there from Kendi is absolutely brilliant. So you can't ignore it if you want to be anti-racist. And it's not just about shouting up about things to be performative or to look as though you know something. It's about picking your time, knowing how to say things, but knowing that you need to do something to counter the racism that's going on. And sometimes it is uncomfortable, but it can always be done. Even if part of being anti-racist is picking your times. That's very, very different from ignoring something.
So the slide, how is anti-racism relevant to social work then? What I've tried to capture here is the professional standards that exist for social workers. the ones that I feel are most relevant to anti-racism and other relevant values and ethics. But you'll see there that there isn't explicit mention of anti-racism or the other values and ethics. They point towards those kind of principles, but they're not explicitly mentioned.
Yeah.
And then there's a few other points that I raise about BASWA's Code of Ethics, where we are looking at revisiting and updating the Code of Ethics in terms of those values and ethics, the strong bedrock of social justice, of AOP, ADP, anti-racist practice, in terms of social work, academia, and just part of the social work history, I guess, that's been a core part of it. There is a couple of statements there from BASWA, initially around George Floyd's murder, and then a fuller statement around promoting anti-racism after that. There's an article on confronting the white elephant, white privilege in social services. That is a hyperlink there on the slide. People have access to my slides, so they'll be able to access that should they wish. But, you'll see the flavour of what I'm getting at there. Trying to knit together what I feel are some of the core elements really of social work, and how there's not a kind of clear mention of them in relation to regulation. And what are your thoughts on that?
It takes me back to when youth justice, before it was even called youth justice, really, before youth offending teams were introduced. The approach to working with young offenders was piecemeal up and down the nation, but it was part of social work. And it moved away from social work in the same way that probation did, to become a standalone organisation, and then youth offending teams were formed. But the value base of what you do in social work is identical to the value base that's required in youth justice work. Therefore, the effect and impact of racist practices, racism, is exactly the same. So the requirement for anti-racism in social work is something I feel comfortable to speak about, even though my experience is all in a very specific area. But I have obviously worked closely with Healthcare Professional Council, with the General Social Care Council. I'm now aware of the way things have gone, and the different organising bodies, and we now have Social Work England. But those organisations that oversee our work have always had code of practice, professional codes, code of ethics, and a list of professional standards. The names have changed for what they might be, but those standards that you've picked out on this slide, the three that you've picked out, are about anti-discriminatory practice and equality of opportunity and avoidance of inequality. Inclusivity is the way forward. All those things I agree with. The only thing that I do think there still needs to be room for a specificity is the right way of pronouncing it, in terms of anti-racist practice. It's not a standalone, because there are the microaggressions that we've talked about, but you do sometimes need to look at what is the effect of racism for this service user, call them what you will, expert by experience. What is the effect of racism thereon, and how do I tackle that? What anti-racism can I deploy? What anti-racist tactics can I deploy as a social worker, as a youth justice worker? And whether that's social work with young people, older people, get into your head. So one of the reference points you've made underneath about where people can go for further information is the cultural competence, and that will differ in terms of which ethnic minority your service user is part of. Cultural competence is a useful term. When combined with intersectionality, I think it's getting somewhere close to what I take from this slide about don't ignore racism as a specific issue, but also do recognise that it is part of oppression, disadvantage, structural as well as individual. And I think social work has a duty, I know social work has a duty, the legislation says it does, to act in a way that isn't oppressive and is inclusive. The articles you've highlighted that people need to look at in social work to see how relevant anti-racism is to social work are spot on.
Thank you. And in terms of confronting the white elephant, I think that's the article, is it, that you're referring to, around white privilege there on the slide? Yeah. Just for people to have a look at that. There is public access to my presentations, so you do get in touch if not, but I think it's a really useful article.
The other thing I wanted to say about that, Wayne, about anti-racism and social work, the black expert approach, you know, if you're white, you can go to one of your black colleagues. I don't think that's always fair. Obviously, I've been banging on about listening to your colleagues who genuinely are expert in what they're talking about, and they've got the lived experience. But it isn't fair as a white social worker to, you know, expect black social workers to take up the cases, or what, you know, to pick things up. It's your job as a white worker to educate yourself, to get the knowledge, including speaking to black colleagues without expecting them to take the burden for you. And it's also true that the black social workers can feel absolutely exhausted by being in the crosshairs for all the racism, the white supremacy that permeates all the institutions, including social work. So you have to be mindful of the fact that you can burn out your black colleagues if you expect them to take too much of the burden. It's a white problem. White people need to sort it out within social work as well as in society.
Okay, Andy, this next slide is you can't read yourself into activism.
Yeah.
And there's just a brief extract from an article that I wrote previously. I just wondered what your thoughts were around some of that.
Okay, right. It's a really helpful way of looking at the whole business of trying to be anti-racist. It was certainly perceived as radical activism in its early days. My work was perceived that way. I completely agree that it shouldn't be. It's not something that you can. They used to talk about taking it down from the shelf and putting it back. It has to be, anti-racist practice has to be endemic in everything you do in your social work, and that requires constant thought, constant awareness. And I said earlier today, you can't unknow the known. And if you know that racism is taking place and having an impact on what you're doing, you can't unknow that either, or you shouldn't. You can deny it, because white privilege would allow a white worker to not bother being anti-racist. Once you've read the sort of stuff that is published, and you know, I'm aware of Dr. Muna Abdi's work and how she approaches the whole stuff, and I can't disagree with the words she says. What I would say, and this isn't a but, it's an also, that there are lived experiences that reading and theoreticizing, if there is such a word, making a theory out of something, don't actually do. There's a risk that if the academics take hold of something and the written material is so purist in its academic approach, that many of the people who were just reading that, whether it's on social media in excerpts or whether they're reading the books or whatever paper they're reading, you can, through reading alone, you can get to the point where academics hijack the issue, in that they're talking about it, often using terminology that's not understood by people who aren't in academia, or understood differently. If a word has a sort of common parlance, but is also understood differently in academia, the subject matter, the content can be hijacked. And what I'm always very frightened of straddling both camps, is the end stop point of that is you sabotage the issue. You hijack it with your language and you sabotage it, where you get to the point where people of all walks of life think, I can't be arsed with this anymore.
Yeah.
I don't want to hear it, because you've isolated the thing into an academic issue. And that's what I take from, you can't read yourself into activism. You have to have the academic awareness, but you also have to know, as a social worker, operational social worker, that your service users won't be aware of that language. Often whether they're black or whether they're white, they won't be aware of that language, the academic language. So you have to make sure that you're not just peddling something that stands academic examination, but doesn't stand up when it's talked about when you go and meet a family or you're talking to them about their experiences. There's a human element that, unfortunately for academics, does mean they have to not dilute what they're saying, but don't hijack the issue with language and making a total theory out of it. There is also, they used to say that, you know, there's always a gap between rhetoric and reality, I think the Stoics say, and yet the Stoics used to wander around talking to each other all the time and discussing these things, but there still remains a gap between rhetoric and reality. I understand the academic books, I love them, I thoroughly enjoy them, they make me think, I enjoy that learning. But if you're a welder, and you know, and you haven't got time because you work in shifts, or if you're whatever job, you know, whatever job you want, if you're an engineer, if you're a social worker, sometimes it's more than just pure academia. There is something happens where the rubber meets the road that, and I'm sorry, I don't mean this in any offensive way to my academic colleagues, black or white, but sometimes where the rubber meets the road, they're not best at articulating the reality. And I'm not an inverted snob. I'm just saying that whilst I adore the academia, and I could listen to Rennie Edo Lodge all day and Afua Hirsch and Ibram X. Kendi, I could read their stuff and I'd love to sit and talk to them. But I can't, and they can't to me, and we can't with all academics. So I suppose a recognition that sometimes things will be said by academics that run the risk, and it is only a risk, it's not a given, of hijack and ultimate sabotage if it becomes too purist.
Do you think, though, that this impatience with the language, for some people, that if it's academic, then it's inaccessible for some people? Yeah. Is that kind of an indication of the climate that we're currently in terms of, like, you know, the public narrative at the moment, certainly the media narrative, where there's this kind of exhaustion of, you know, conversations around race, and the conversations that there are really quite divisive, aren't they? Getting to the point where almost even anti-racism it feels like is sort of being seen as unacceptable, because it's too militant or unapologetic, you know, in its presentation. Do you see what I mean? So there's some issues there around language where there's a kind of an impatience, an evolution of language, and actually it seems to be disadvantaging the anti-racism movement even further, if you see what I mean. Yeah,
I do. I think some of that is inevitable because of the way language is interpreted and how we use language, all of us. It's incredibly powerful, and therefore there are some inevitable consequences of the time delay, the lag factor before people catch on. And much more worryingly for me is that it's also a very, very convenient divider if you weaponize it. And I think I'm seeing that in mainstream media. I don't look at social media, but I'm told about it, and I think it's weaponized. And I think the risk there is that, I suppose, in the same way that the content gets lost or hijacked and sabotaged by weaponizing language on either side of that discussion, I worry that it will be used to disable the really useful work that's going on.
I'm joined again now for the Triple A Reflections with Liz Howard, Maureen Mguni, and Rachel Rook. I'll let them just say hello briefly. Over to you, Liz.
Oh, hi. Thanks, Wayne. Great to be here, part of the Triple A show Reflections. I'm Liz Howard. I'm professional officer with BASWA England, social worker and aspiring wannabe ally.
Thank you, Liz. And Maureen, hello.
Oh, hi. My name is Maureen, and I am a senior social worker.
Fine.
And I also teach social work at the University of Brighton. In addition to this, I'm doing my doctoral research on female genital mutilation. And one of the things that I'm tackling is decolonizing the curriculum, as well as embedding anti-racist principles within academia.
Thank you very much, Maureen. And Rachel, hi.
Hi everyone, I'm Rachel Rook. I'm a registered social worker. I'm a full-time lecturer in social work and social care, and I'm also a practicing approved mental health professional.
Thank you, and nice to see you all again. So, following that clip with myself and Andy, I just want to ask you a few different questions that we can reflect on as a small group. Thinking about Andrew's lived experiences that we explored in that clip, I wondered, Rachel, what are your thoughts about that? Is there anything that jumped out for you in particular?
Yeah, there is. It was when I was listening, and I was hearing all the great work that Andy was doing when he recognised that these were issues. There were issues of racism for Black people, and that he was trying to work alongside his colleagues. When he spoke about there being some scepticism from Black colleagues, and I completely understand that. I know that scepticism, and I think it's really important to. For that to be aired and for people to be aware that there will be some scepticism, and for white people not to take that as a rejection. I think there has to be an understanding that, you know, all of a sudden the world is listening now to Black people, but it hasn't been the case, and you know, so there is a bit of caution, there is a bit of scepticism, and I think that is the nature of allyship. It can't just be oh, well, suddenly I'm giving you my allyship and you should be grateful for it. It has to be a relationship, like I said in the previous episode, that's built on trust and understanding. So I think if you do encounter scepticism from Black colleagues, have a conversation about that. You know, because there have been too many token gestures. You can understand why there's scepticism. So, but I really appreciate Andy, you know, saying that and actually talking about that experience and the fact that he carried on. He recognised that and he carried on attempting to work in partnership.
Yeah, thank you for that. And it really resonates with something Liz said in the last reflective session that we had, actually, about the concept of white saviour and how some people want to be allies, but they may be completely unaware of the fact that too much of that, or too much good intent but tokenism, could actually lead to, you know, that white saviour idea. So thank you for sharing that. Okay. I'd like to come to Liz next and talk about the relevance of that clip with Andy to social work values and ethics, and whether you think we sort of bore that out within that discussion, Liz.
Yeah, thanks, Wayne. Definitely. I thought that values and ethics were kind of prevalent throughout, really, and it was all about, you know, Andy, again, talking about his journey and his experiences and the things that he's been able to do, both personally and professionally, again, about how, you know, being anti-racist in practice, it's about living and practicing social work values, which includes being non-judgmental, picking up on what Rachel's just said there about building trust and developing relationships, cultivating that kind of culture that enables difficult conversations to happen. And that's really, you know, what allyship is all about. It's about understanding where you can kind of move things forward in a situation or make the difference, and again, being just really conscious about that concept of being the white saviour. I'm not saying about steaming in and changing everything and, you know, for me aren't amazing, but I think what Andy really kind of got across for me is that idea about being present, being conscious, being alert and aware and tuned into what was going on around him, taking notice of things and how that was making him feel, but also about how that was making other people feel as well. And I think as social workers, the kind of real message for me there is, if we see or hear something or feel something that doesn't sit right with us, we don't just ignore it. We do need to do something about it, and we've got a professional responsibility to do something about it as well. And that's not just about our professional life, that's our personal life as well. So it is difficult, it is challenging, and it's uncomfortable. We've kind of explored that before, that feeling of uncomfortableness, but actually if that's how you're feeling, you're on to the right thing there. So that's important.
Yeah, that really resonated, Liz, what you said there. And as you were speaking, what sprung to mind for me was, yes, that obvious relevance to social work values and ethics in terms of allyship and anti-racism. But I guess the kind of glaring omission that there is in the professional standards for social workers and the education and training standards. You know, there's an obvious need there for social workers to be held to account with regards to working with service users. But I guess there's also a need that, in all honesty, I've only become aware of, that social workers need to have to other social workers as well, and what they might expect from their managers in terms of anti-racism and, you know, anti-oppressive and anti-discriminatory values and ethics. So yeah, what you've just described there really just brought that front and center for me, so thank you. I'd like to move now to Maureen, please, if that's all right, and just to explore what Andrew and myself said about microaggressions and your take on that concept, Maureen. What are your thoughts, please?
So I was really happy to hear it from a white person, I must say, microaggressions, because normally, you know, it's me complaining about microaggressions and feeling them, you know, facing the name calling, you know, being called militant, angry Black woman, and, you know, sometimes people making jokes and then, you know, jokes that are not funny, we're not laughing together, you know, things that are really offensive. And it was really good to hear Andy calling this out and, you know, giving a list. So if anyone were to listen, you would know what, you know, what microaggression looks like. And I mean, I think it's something that's really powerful in the sense that I think there's a need for a whole training on microaggressions, you know, from the point of view of Black people, people of color who feel it, but also from the point of view of allies, you know, who now start to notice what it looks like. So that, because there's also something to be said about Black people taking all the work and doing all the work to educate everyone else. And sometimes it seems more powerful when somebody who is not Black is saying, you know, this is what we are doing and this is what it looks like. Let's stop doing this. So that's what I took from that discussion.
What's highlighted from the discussions between you and Andy is really clear about the way that society, institutions within society and systems within society, and the way that they're organised, the way that they're constructed and delivered, and who's got the power within those domains, means that, you know, from a very young age, Black people are targeted by the system, and that came across really, really strongly, and also more likely to find themselves within that system, whether a crime has been committed or not. And that's really all about the structural inequalities that exist within our society, and that, you know, means that access to opportunities are affected for Black people from a very young age, and that includes education, housing, health, money, employment, security. People's life chances are very, very different, and therefore the likelihood of being involved within the criminal justice system is far higher. And I think once in the system, that the racism that exists there is so deeply rooted that all comes into play as well. So I think, in answer to the question, yes, I think they are intrinsically linked, and I think Andrew made that point really, really well.
Okay, thanks very much. And Rachel or Maureen, is there anything you'd like to follow up with that in terms of crime and race and their relationship?
I would like to, Wayne. I think, again, a lot of the issues that Andy was talking about, and it's great having an ally like Andy because he's just so old school but very current. Yeah. And so he's just able to give almost like a bird's eye view of what's happening. And it's just so unfortunate, and it's so sad as well that actually what he's talking about, you know, a lot of it hasn't changed. You know, and so the change has to come from people like us, you know, people that are interested in making a change. But you only have to look at the Lammy Review from 2017, which, you know, blatantly states that those who are charged, tried and punished are still disproportionately likely to come from minority communities. And I think what he said about his experience of going to court, who were the judges, you know, you still got, I would say, the wrong people, you know, using the law. The law is the law, it's neutral, but it's quite clear when you look into how the law is used regarding the crimes of Black people, you know, compared with the same crimes committed by white people, that there is some flexibility in how the law is used, and that flexibility is not often directed towards Black people.
Yeah, I think that's being generous. I think it's just there's a significant disparity, isn't there, really, in how Black people are treated compared to white people in the criminal justice system. So yeah, I'm glad that Andy and myself and that discussion was able to illuminate that, really, from the perspective of allyship. Okay, I'd like to just finish this reflective session just with some book recommendations from each of you with regards to allyship or anti-racism. Are there any specifically that spring to mind? I'll start with Maureen, please.
Okay, so there's one of my favorite books called Habeas Viscus, and it's by a guy called Alexander Wahilier. So he's talking about how, you know, I'm trying to not do what Andy said people shouldn't do, just make things too academic so that, you know, it kind of loses its meaning. But what this guy says, he brings, you know, centrality to race and race notions, and he's saying how we can't really have any real discussions about politics or have views without actually bringing race into it. So we have to actually appreciate and realize that, you know, there's different power struggles within any given society. And he talks about, you know, how people are categorized into full humans, not quite humans, and, you know, subhumans or non-humans even. So and he talks particularly about Black women, and so obviously I'm using this for my just, you know, for my study, but he talks about how Black women's bodies are policed and how you know, they're written about as if they're non-human. And so he's saying to reverse this, we need to actually be writing, but from the point of view of the Black woman, so the one who suffers. So we need to actually amplify the voices of the people who are actually being abused or who are actually experiencing those things. So yeah, this is one of my favorite books. I had to read it 3 times before I could really understand it. But now that I understand it, I really like it. So that's my book recommendation.
Thank you very much. Okay. So Rachel, thinking about book recommendations, what are your thoughts?
So for me, I would be recommending, I would actually recommend Superior by Angela Saini. And it's non-fiction, but I think it's an easy read, and it provides a really provocative account of ethnicity and how we've come to this point, and how we think about ethnicity.
All right, okay. Thank you very much. And Liz, what's your book recommendation? I'll give you 2 because we're limited for time. Sorry.
Thanks, Wayne. Okay, that's good. I've got a fiction one to start with, which is Mary Blackman Noughts and Crosses series. It's recently been televised on the BBC as well, and that really, it's in effect kind of reverse racism, and it really shows the power of a dominating race and culture and how all of that plays out. And I think, again, in a really strong way, that as a white person, I'm confronted by how racism manifests in every aspect of society, culture, hierarchy, power, all those themes that we've been talking about today. And then I know we're short of time, so the book that I've recently purchased, which I'm about to start reading, is by Emma Dabiri, and she is also the author of Don't Touch My Hair, and it's called What White People Can Do Next, and it's a practical book around allyship, and it's about taking that to the next level in terms of action. And some of the themes from that are around learning from the past, stopping denial, leaving guilt behind, moving on into what we're doing as action. And it really kind of, the reason I've chosen that obviously is because I'm on my journey with allyship, but it reminds me of a term that I heard in a webinar that was with Jenny Garrett and colleagues, which is all about actionable allyship. So again, thinking about what we've been talking about today, Maureen and Rachel have talked about as well, what am I doing, what action can and am I taking, and coming back to that point all the time.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Liz, and to Rachel and Maureen as well. So thanks again to my special guests, Liz Howard, Maureen Magooney and Rachel Rook, for their contributions during that reflective discussion. Extra special thanks to Andrew Thompson, of course, for sharing his valuable insights. I hope you enjoyed the Triple A Chinwag, and please refer back to it on your authentic anti-racist allyship journey. And thank you to you, the viewer, for watching and engaging with our ideas and our thoughts around authentic anti-racist allyship. My name is Wayne Reid, and you've been watching the Triple A Chinwag. See you next time.